Did you know the Nigerians govern a sector of space occupied by several different humanoid species?
If we say yes, will you feed us?
One of those species is the Benkarans. They occupy just 10% of Nigerian space, but take up nearly 80% of the space in Nigerian prisons.
Maybe they commit more crimes.
So we're seeing a large amount of black mob violence. If that sounds rough, well, look at the videos. Are these not in fact mobs? Well, they look like mobs to me. If this is not a mob, I don't know what you would call a mob. Okay, are they black? Well, they look mostly black to me. I know there's kind of a psyop going on, say, oh, it's the white people who did this somehow. I don't know how on earth they're trying to pull that off. Okay, are they violent? Well, they look violent to me. Okay, violent black mobs, true. There's nothing incorrect in pointing that out. What triggered these riots? Well, a news event. Okay, what is news? What is news? Is it anything that I say? Is it anything that your friend says? Is it, some people may say in the colloquial sense, oh, that's news to me. But when we say news with a capital N, we're really talking about something that is said by specific organizations that are promoted by the government, promoted by universities, promoted by NGOs, and treated as authoritative by these institutions. And that's part of promotion, is treating as authoritarian. And you know who I'm talking about. CNN, NBC, Fox, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, the usual suspects. So we know what capital N news is. They're sort of like text and video blog platforms, and they give jobs to people with journalism majors from certain universities that control the supply of the journalism majors that go into these places. These journalism majors who write these stories, and they give their ice cold takes in front of cameras, they're easy to control because they, with a very few exceptions, can't get an audience on their own. And that's perfect. That makes them easy to control because they're sort of locked into their career as a journalism major working for CNN, for example. And these groups, these sort of text and video blog groups like CNN, they have been elevated by other institutions. And I don't know if there's some grand conspiracy about this, but the effect is that they control what the public is thinking about. That's the effect. Whether it's planned, whether it just sort of happened, whether it's emergent, doesn't matter. The effect is that they operate to control what the public is thinking about and what facts they know. In early YouTube, I've been around long enough to know about the pre-Google YouTube. The CNN channel, the New York Times channel, they couldn't draw flies to poop. Nobody cared about what they had to say about anything. Only later, when YouTube and Google became publishers and started to elevate these, what I'm going to call the highly controlled blog and video groups like CNN, then they got people to see it and start taking them seriously again. Otherwise, if not for Google and the real power structure promoting these blog and video groups, you'd just watch independent journalists dumping raw feeds, and there'd be nobody to tell you how to feel about anything or select which facts you're supposed to know. It'd just be sort of a random mishmash of stuff that people happen to record as they're walking around, sort of citizen journalists. Now, this is the context in which people like Mike Cernovich or Mitt Romney are speaking. They're speaking on the topics which this sort of controlled media tells them that they should care about. Now, in 2019, there were 370 whites who were shot to death by police, 235 blacks, 158 Hispanics, 39 other, and 202 of unknown race who were shot and killed by police. This averages to about 2.75 per day, so, if all these are treated equally, you should be hearing about 2 to 3 police shootings per day, and a few other deaths by other methods. Most of it's done by shootings. That's how police actually kill people. But, in this case of George Floyd, that's actually not a shooting. But most of the time it's a shooting. But you're not hearing about them. You hear about selected instances which are selected for you to tell you what to care about and how to feel about it. This is also sort of why it's basically impossible that this is some sort of revolutionary action against the system, right? When the system, quote unquote, is telling you precisely to care about this. And they're telling the police to stand down and let you destroy, people's lives in destroying their businesses and destroying their livelihoods and stuff. Target will be fine. They have insurance. They're a big corporation. They'll be, and even if that fails, they'll be bailed out by Congress. So, going after Target or going after Walmart or anything is not going to have any effect because they're part of this. They're part of the system and they'll be protected. The people you're destroying are the small businesses, right? Would you have heard about Floyd George or George Floyd if it wasn't on the news, quote unquote, on the news? Of course not. An event you otherwise never would have heard about becomes elevated and then made important. And CNN, NBC, New York Times, Fox, they're all the same. They all report the same stories because they're not actually independent meaningfully. They serve the same function. That's why you can say something like, I heard it on the news, because they're all the same. It's the same news. They're controlled the same way and they serve the same function. And it doesn't matter who's writing the stories. In fact, you probably have no idea who writes any particular story. You just see that CNN tag and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter because they're all just compliant journalism majors. They're interchangeable, and they were pre-filtered by the process of getting a journalism degree. They're actually a kind of bureaucrat. And that's why these news outlets have a bureaucratic feel to them, because that's precisely what they are. Now, regarding police shootings, which is most of police killings, the case of Floyd George, he wasn't shot, but whatever. We're talking about police killings, and the main way police kill people is by shooting. So the data on police shootings is going to reflect overall police killings. Blacks are, of course, overrepresented compared to their number. Okay, but they're not overrepresented based on homicide rate or as a percentage of people who shot the police. Blacks, 12.6% of the U.S. population in 2019, but 29.3% of the people killed by cops where the race is known were black. However, blacks made up 34.09% of cop killers where the race is known. Whites and Hispanics combined make up 65.83% of the people killed by cops in shootings and made up 63.64% of cop killers. In terms of the cop killers, the FBI doesn't distinguish whites from Hispanics, so the cop killer number is a combination of whites and Hispanics. If you separated whites from Hispanics, I suspect the white proportion in isolation would be lower. So it seems to line up, at least in the big picture. Blacks appear to simply be more aggressive towards cops if the rate of cop killing is a good indicator of overall aggression. Not saying that this is justified or anything, but it's a case against racial bias. Cops can still be assholes generally, they could be, but the point here is a racial bias. And whenever you do a proper analysis of data on this, racial bias doesn't come out once you consider behavior of groups, of demographic groups. So when a story piece is pushed by the controlled media, they only push one type of event, and that is when a white cop kills a black victim, or in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it's white people killing a black man. Now, assuming all cops are white, which they're not, but if we assumed all cops are white, that would only happen 29% of the time in terms of who's killing who. Now, in 2018, don't have data from 2019, in 2018, whites and Hispanics were 77.1% of all police officers. If officers have an even racial distribution, this means that in all likelihood, only 22.38% of police killings involve white or Hispanic officers and a black victim. But in reality, black neighborhoods tend to have blacker police forces. Not as black as the neighborhoods they're policing. Police, as a rule, are whiter than the general population, but blacks are probably more likely to deal with a black cop than white people are. And since black cops are actually more likely than white cops to shoot a black person in a given encounter, this would all mean that the percentage of police killings that involve a white cop and a black victim is going to be less than 22.38% of the time. Also, take out the Hispanic number, whatever that is, it's going to be less as a result of that as well. So I don't know what the exact number is. It's probably going to be somewhere around 17% of all police killings involve a non-Hispanic white cop and a black victim. Although that's just an estimate based on percentages of the population. But we know for a fact that it's no more than 29%. Absolutely. And it's probably no more than 22.38%, almost certainly no more than 22.38%. And given the Hispanic proportion of the quote-unquote white cops, it's going to be less than that. And also given the fact that black people are more likely to interact with a black cop than a white person, that's going to drive that down even as non-Hispanic whites as a percentage of the cops who shoot blacks. And yet, that scenario where a non-Hispanic white cop kills a black person, that is all you ever see. That is the only scenario that is presented to you by the journalism major clubs. The question you should be asking is, why do these interchangeable journalism majors who work at controlled media orgs only highlight killings with a white cop and a black victim, when it happens that combination probably only around 17% of the time? Those who think that by protesting this, that you are fighting the system, honey, this is a system narrative that was presented to you. They want you mad about this. The only reason you are mad about this is because this was picked and highlighted and presented to you. That's why they're showing you this. Because Joe Biden is a trash candidate and they need to gin you up to vote for him, okay? You're being ginned up to believe in unreality because they need you to vote for a guy who has dementia, Joe. And that's why Donald Trump is sending the DOJ after those white guys who shot Ahmaud Arbery. Because Trump wants you to think he's on your side. He's not, and neither is Biden. But all this is just a game to get you ginned up to vote for Biden, and Trump is trying to counter that by posturing that he's on your side. Consider the free cash Trump mailed out that blacks got at disproportionate rates. The establishment doesn't want Trump, even though Trump isn't really doing anything meaningful to destroy the establishment, but they still don't like him. They want dementia head Biden because he's controllable, right? Just like the journalism majors at the alphabet soup controlled media orgs. They like having those journalism majors who can't make it on their own because then they're bound to the quote-unquote news agency like CNN, and they can then be controlled and they then toe the line. They don't get too creative. They don't strike out on their own. They're in sort of the New York Times, Fox, NBC, CNN sort of plantation, that whole sort of system. And so they're presenting you with white cop, black victim stories in order to get you hopped up and angry, even though these are extremely rare events and don't even reflect racial bias once black behavior is taken into account. If you compare the percent of blacks killed by cops versus the blacks who commit homicides, blacks commit consistently about half of all homicides where the race of the perpetrator is known, and this is far less than the percentage that blacks make up among those killed by the cops. And I use homicide as an indicator of general criminality because with things like robbery and assault and rape, these are all subject to reporting variance and police leniency. And with homicide, there's no judgment call. There's a dead body, the crime happened. The only issue with homicide is who done it, but that's also a problem with any other crime. Homicide is at least free of the problem of determining if a crime occurred. So the closest lifeline to reality in terms of race differences in general criminality is going to be the homicide number. Now, one thing, and my opponents will bring up, are simulation experiments showing police bias against blacks. And, it looks like they have a point. Let me present the most recent and, in my opinion, the best one. It's the best one because it has the biggest sample size, it has the most sophisticated method. There's all sorts of reasons, and I'll explain it. This is from Lois James et al. In 2016. And he took 80 police officers, randomly selected police officers, and put them through 1,517 reaction scenarios where they were put in a sound-deadened room with HD screen and a light gun, right? So they had a light gun that they pointed at the screen, and it emitted a muzzle flash, and it fired a blank. So it would bang, it sounded like a gun. And then the screen would register where the police shot. The police must react to various scenarios presented to them, which involves white and black citizens. It's a controlled environment where the white and black actors on the screen behave identically, and they look at how the cops, right, I think 40 of them were presented scenarios with blacks, 40% of them were presented scenarios with whites. And the HD screens are large enough that they are life-size. The cop must then decide very quickly where and if to shoot. Now, in terms of speed of reaction in the cop shooting the person on the screen from a given baseline, they take 1.32 seconds to shoot the white person. but they only take 1.09 seconds to shoot the black person. Okay, so that looks like they're more trigger happy in shooting black people. What about error rates, when the police shot someone in error when the citizen was not about to attack the officer? That is, they killed what is, according to the scenario, an innocent person. Well, they shot blacks in error 14% of the time, but they shot whites in error only 1% of the time. Or in absolute numbers of all the simulations, the police shot whites in error 2 times, but blacks in error 54 times. Okay, so that looks like some anti-black racial bias. So this simulation data is evidence of some anti-black bias in the police force. Assuming these are a representative sample of police generally, we more or less extrapolate this onto all police, evidence of an anti-black bias. In a controlled setting, given identical behavior, cops will shoot blacks more, at least in a simulation. But consider that, based on homicide rates and the rates at which blacks kill cops, this may actually be a reflection of experience that ends up being unfair to black people who aren't violent, which is to say, most black people. So if you're a black person, but you're not aggressive or violent, then you're gonna suffer from this, right? Simply because cops are, quite frankly, playing the odds. Oh wait, I messed that up. I got the races mixed up in the simulation. Oh yeah, that's right. Cops were 14 times more likely to shoot a white non-violent citizen. Okay. Yeah, and they actually had the faster reaction time when shooting whites than when shooting blacks. Whoops. I got that mixed up. Well, what do you know? In a simulation setting, cops are more trigger happy against whites than against blacks. Well, there it is. There we have evidence of anti-white bias among police. Now, certainly if you accepted the simulation results as evidence of anti-black bias when the results were reversed, well, now you'll accept it as evidence of anti-white bias, right? I mean, you wouldn't start straining to find some methodological problem with it now that you know what the results are. I mean, you're not that predictable, are you? Now, you may be watching this and wanting me to talk specifically about Floyd George or Ahmaud Arbery or whatever. And okay, I'll go ahead. Here's the interracial homicide instances, black on white and white on black. And the Ahmaud Arbery is one of the whites killing blacks. So there it is. And here's the people killed by police in 2020. Floyd George is one of those. All right, I talked about those. In fact, I talk about these episodes more than they deserve. Right there was more than they deserve. If you're talking about these individual instances any more than I've talked about, you're giving it way more attention than it deserves. You're being controlled by institutional media, controlled media, that is putting these episodes in front of you and telling you what to care about and telling you what you're supposed to know. While we're talking about simulations, let's talk about a simulation involving other things, or simulations involving other things where blacks and whites engage in identical behavior and how they're evaluated. L.J. Zigarelle did a fun paper looking at 17 experiments that he could find that looked at how black and white people were treated and evaluated given otherwise identical behaviors or characteristics. So one of the paper he looked at was Prager and Fries, 2003, and he asked people how much government help this guy Michael should get based on all sorts of factors: employment, age, inheritance, criminal record. Both groups offered to give Michael more money, but both whites and blacks said that Michael should get more money if Michael was black. In the black condition, they both showed a pro-black bias. Both whites and blacks did. Given identical history, identical inheritance, identical everything, right? They say give the black guy more money. Oliver and Lee asked people to evaluate how fat someone was using computer images of black and white people who had otherwise identical bodies, right? These are identical bodies, just with a few black facial characteristics and white facial characteristics, and of course the skin color. On that, both blacks and whites rated blacks as being slightly fatter. Interestingly, blacks were more likely than whites to consider the black image fatter. Like, both blacks and whites considered the black person with an otherwise identical image as being fatter than the white person, but blacks to a higher degree. So blacks actually showed a more anti-black bias here than whites did. Cottrell and Newberg, 2004. This one is a little bit more difficult to explain. It involved measuring the subject's emotional response to a target racial group facing 7 different what I would call hardship scenarios. That's not the term they used in the study, but I think that's the best way to explain it. So 7 different hardship scenarios, and they looked at the subject's emotional reaction if the group were black or white. Now, both whites and blacks were more likely to favor their own race, but blacks favored their own race about 3 times as much. Oh, also, I'm not doing the bait and switch anymore. I'm not going to present the results one way and then say they're another anymore. That was a one-time thing. Okay, Bernard 2005 gave little bios of various lawyers, being either male or female, or black or white, and the subjects were to rate how competent they thought the lawyer was. Both whites and blacks rated otherwise identical black lawyers as being more competent than white lawyers, right? They gave them characteristics, they gave them case history, they gave them win-loss ratios, they gave them all sorts of stuff. Otherwise identical lawyers, both whites and blacks rated the black lawyers as more competent. And they also rated women as being more competent than otherwise identical men. And it goes on and on. You can read the analysis if you want, linked in the description. Basically, across all 17 studies, whites showed a pro-black bias of about 0.1 standard deviation, while blacks showed a pro-black bias of about 0.3 standard deviations. Now, what this means, in a rather vulgar way, is that whites have to be at the 61.79th percentile to be considered as good as a black person to black people. And they have to be at the 53.98th percentile to be considered as good as a black person to other white people. Which is to say, for identical behavior or characteristics, blacks get bumped up 11.79 points out of 100 in terms of how other blacks perceive them. But blacks only get an extra 3.9 points for how white people perceive them. Not surprisingly, blacks tend to think that whites evaluate them too harshly, right? Because whites only give them 3.9 points, but blacks give them 11.79, so therefore whites are racist. See, that's how this works. Now, perhaps more germane to all the stuff that's in quote-unquote the news, or the news that you listen to and you're told to care about, is race and crime and cops and courts and studies on jurors. So another fun study was from Mitchell in 2005, and he looked at 34. Well, it was a meta-analysis. Mitchell, 2005, looked at 34 studies in which people acted as jurors and voted on whether a given defendant was guilty and how long a sentence should be. So over these 34 studies, blacks showed an in-group bias about 15 times larger than that of whites. In fact, whites showed virtually none. Right? These are jury simulations, and where they're basically presented a case. They're presented a white defendant, a black defendant, otherwise identical defense, identical circumstance, identical evidence. So they're controlling for all that stuff, and they're looking at if there's any racial bias in white jurors or black jurors. And what they found is massive racial bias among black jurors. I can't say what this means in terms of likelihood of not going to jail if you're black and you have a black or white jury, because it's 34 studies and they all have different conviction rates. But if you're white, you get virtually nothing from an all-white jury. If you're black, you get something. Again, these are studies with black and white defendants who are otherwise identical in charge, evidence, courtroom behavior. They also looked at racial bias in sentence length. White showed virtually no bias, while black showed a 0.731 standard deviation bias. Now, what this means in percentage terms is that blacks will sentence otherwise identical whites to the 76.73 percentile of what they would sentence blacks, right? Whereas a racially unbiased jury will sentence them at the 50th percentile. Whites will sentence otherwise identical blacks to the 53.09th percentile of what they would sentence the same person if they were white. So what this means is that blacks with a black jury get about 26.73 points, almost a quarter of the entire variation in sentence length if they have a black jury. But blacks get punished about 3.09% if they have an all-white jury. So you're not getting hardly any of an effect for whites, but you're getting a huge effect if you're black and you have a black jury. So a lot more racial bias among black jurors than among whites. Not surprisingly, black people consider white jurors to be really, really bigoted. Also, blacks have way higher recidivism rates, as in being a repeat offender. So even after controlling for recidivism risk factors, there actually remains a pure racial effects, i.e. blacks are more likely to be repeat offenders even with an identical recidivism score. And the recidivism score is what they use to sort of predict. They use all sorts of factors like family history, nature of the crime. They have a whole science, the science of being a repeat offender, the science of recidivism, and they give people a recidivism score. And even with the same score, blacks are more likely to be repeat offenders. So even if white jurors aren't thinking about that, whites may be effectively fair. Okay, which is to say the 3.09% racial bias that whites have is probably fair, or maybe even more than fair. The problem is that all these issues that I talk about here, they all converge and they reinforce each other. So you take racial favoritism, pro-black favoritism at the universities, at companies, government jobs, all known as affirmative action. You have to deal with the callback myth, right? The myth that employers don't hire someone if they have a black-sounding name. That's been shown to be a myth. You got to talk about slavery and colonialism and segregation in South Africa and the Congo, right? There's all these things that have to talk about, and that's why what I'm doing here, making this video, is kind of futile, because you have a whole system of thought. Okay, this video is going to have much of an effect because what you have is an overarching ideology with a whole bunch of oppression myths that rest on each other and reinforce each other. And so knocking out one or two here isn't going to tear down the entire fantasy structure. And it all converges, right? All these beliefs converge. That's the meaning of the term when people say, "Oh, this person is totally converged," right? They have all these beliefs that they all converge on each other, and it all acts as one system. So it's not. So when you criticize, like let's say you criticize the conventional narrative on slavery, colonialism, segregation, South Africa, and the Congo. Okay, it's not really 5 different topics. It's the same topic. It's the same convergent narrative because they all reinforce and they all sort of grow together or die together. Okay, let me put it this way: if you say, for example, that segregation was fine, there's nothing immoral about whites wanting to have their own neighborhood. Let's say you say that. What are you going to be called? You're going to be called a quote-unquote racist. And racist, in effect, only means whites, right? It only means white people not having enough of a positive view of black and brown, right? That's what it means. Or what would be a criticism of saying, well, blacks are being shot by police, but they're actually being shot less than their behavior warrants. What are you called if you say that? You call the same thing, racist. So it's all of a piece. It's all an overarching narrative. It's a single thing, right? These aren't actually separate issues. And I think at some level, everyone kind of knows that these are not separate issues, that this is all one overarching ideology. This is all one overarching narrative that is being critiqued. And the critiquers are, of course, called, heretics, communists, or race, whatever the term du jour is at your place and time in history. Whatever the heretic analog is at your place and time in history. I think I'll end on this. Your perception of discrimination does not mean that you are discriminated against. From a Pew survey in 2016, younger black people reported having experienced discrimination more than those 65 and older. And blacks with college degrees report more discrimination than those without college degrees. Now, of course, this is false. Blacks without college degrees, while blacks in general aren't racially discriminated against, blacks with just a high school diploma almost certainly face more instances of racial discrimination to the extent they exist. Now, in reality, there's anti-black discrimination, pro-black discrimination, anti-white discrimination. There's discrimination all over the place, right? Discrimination, people discriminate all the time, and they racially discriminate all the time. The question is, what is the net effect, right? Are blacks more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? Are whites more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? That's how you need to look at this, because that's how the world actually works. right? It's not like everyone is either neutral or everyone is uniformly mildly anti-white or mildly anti-black. What's actually happening in the real world is people have racial biases going in all directions all the time, okay? When I say blacks have a pro-black or anti-white, when I say whites have a pro-black or anti-white bias of about 1/10 of a standard deviation, I don't mean that all whites have that mild pro-black bias. I'm saying that whites, on the whole, it averages out to 1/10 of a standard deviation pro-black bias, or anti-white bias, whichever way you want to look at it. Let's keep going. An NPR survey in 2017 asked blacks if they were ever, or a family member was ever, unfairly stopped or treated by the police. Those 65 or older, i.e. those who were born before civil rights, they were the least likely to say that they were unfairly stopped by police or a family member was unfairly stopped by police. And blacks in suburban areas are more likely to say that they were unfairly stopped, while blacks in the hood were less likely to say so. What this shows is that your belief that you were treated unfairly, it's a product of conditioning. If anyone was being unfairly harassed by the cops, it's going to be blacks in urban areas, and it's going to be the less educated ones who don't get into the urban areas. And older blacks, according to the mythology surrounding segregation, should have been harassed by cops the most. But what actually happened, what you're actually seeing, is that older blacks, they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as blacks are today. They were to a lesser extent, but they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as you are. And urban blacks, who are less educated and watch less controlled media, they don't hear about how oppressed they are as much as suburban blacks do, who are more educated. They watch, the journalism blogs, right? They watch CNN and Fox and stuff, right? And so they're told that they're oppressed. So you believe you're oppressed because you're told you're oppressed. There's no relation to actual oppression. This principle is also seen among women. From a Pew survey in 2017, the more quote-unquote educated, years in school, a woman is, the more likely she is to perceive oppression. Even though, if any group of women is being on net oppressed, right, which I don't think is the case at all for any class of women, but according to the narrative, it should be the least educated women who are the most oppressed. But that's not what you see here. The variable here is exposure to ideology. It's perception. And of course, we look at Republican versus Democrat. Democrat women perceive more oppression because their ideology tells them they are oppressed. Do you think Republican women are more or less oppressed than Democrat women? Neither are oppressed, but Republican women probably have fewer bonus points for being a woman than Democrat women, and yet they're less likely to say they're oppressed. And this is actually a dampening effect because Republicans actually have higher levels of education than Democrats. This is true. I'll post a link saying that this is true in the description. Sorry if that rustles your jimmies. Sorry, not sorry. This is true. So the effects of going to college, isolated from ideology, are going to be higher because Republicans are actually more likely to go to college. So if you have a Democrat woman who goes to college and gets a post-grad, she is going to think she is the most oppressed person on the planet. That is a recipe for believing you're oppressed. Being a Democrat and spending lots and lots of years in college, getting a post-grad, you are going to believe that the world is out to get you. If you're a Republican woman who doesn't go to college, you're not going to perceive yourself as being oppressed at all, right? Because you have the least exposure to those narratives. And so all you're dealing with is the world as it's actually presented in front of you. This is also seen by generation cohort, of which gender is thought to have it easier. Older generations see women as having it easier, while starting with millennials, the perception is that men have it easier. Again, it's a matter of ideology. It has nothing to do with reality. This is also seen among Hispanics from a Pew poll in 2016. Older Hispanics are less likely to perceive discrimination, and foreign-born are less likely to perceive discrimination than U.S.-born. Now, according to oppression narratives, foreign-born Hispanics from, say, the 1970s should certainly have been more oppressed than U.S.-born Hispanics today. And yet, that's not what they say, That's not what they believe because it's all just perception. Foreign-born Hispanics in the 1970s weren't told that they were oppressed. U.S.-born Hispanics today are told that they're oppressed, and people believe what they're told by the institutions that they, for whatever reason, believe as authoritative, right? Like the journalism clubs, like CNN, that's authoritative. From Harvard in 2017, Latinos saying that they were unfairly stopped by police, 42% with a college degree say they were unfairly stopped, while only 25% with high school or less say they were ever unfairly stopped. Again, it's in all likelihood, if any of these groups were unfairly stopped, right, and there's a chance that none of them were in reality, but if any group was being unfairly stopped, it was probably the ones with a high school degree or less, right? Not the ones with a college degree, right? But the college degrees say they were stopped more because they went to college and they were told about how oppressed they are. Blacks are more likely to believe they are discriminated against when interacting with police or trying to vote if they live in a majority black area than in a majority white areas. But if they're in a majority black area, who's doing the discriminating? According to the oppression narrative, shouldn't blacks be most oppressed when they're surrounded by whites? This difference in perception makes sense when you recognize that it's just a result of the spread of ideology, right? When blacks are around blacks, the ideology spreads more than it does when blacks are around whites. It has nothing to do with any actual oppression, because plot twist, there is none. And that's a good point to end on. Now, you can tell stories about some white guy who doesn't like black people or Mexicans or whatever, but those stories are meaningless without considering the net effect. Because there are also white people who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-black, rather fewer of those, and they get ostracized massively. Hispanics who are anti-Hispanic, Hispanics who are anti-white. And so pointing out that this or that incident happened, like a thing happened, well, that doesn't mean anything. You have to look at the whole effect. And when you do, when you look at the whole track of things, well, if you're black, probably if you're Hispanic, but certainly if you're black, well, it's good news. You're not actually oppressed. Your life and all of its outcomes, that's you. This is you. Right? It's not something that's being done to you by others. If anything, the system is pumping you up, is helping you out in any little way it can. But the effects of anti-white policies and pro-black policies, the effects of these things are actually pretty marginal. There's no real big effect in any of systemic racism or anything. Right? There's probably a mild anti-white effect and a mild pro-black effect, but nothing that's going to affect your life outcomes by like 1 or 2 percentage points. Right? So the effects are small. What's actually happening is that where you are, that's you. Okay, it's you. The system isn't really having much of an effect on you. Now, the deeper cut is that you never were oppressed, and that it is in fact always been you. But that's a whole. I mean, this video would go on for a few hours to go through all that. You can perceive yourself as being put upon no matter what. And whether or not you perceive yourself as being put upon is today entirely a function of your conditioning. Are you a Democrat or Republican? How old are you? Did you go to college? How many years did you go into college? Do you live in a majority black or majority white neighborhood? Those factors right there, those are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. It's going to explain about 70 to 80% of how oppressed you think you are. Now, there's going to be some special snowflakes who, despite being a Democrat in an all-black area with a post-grad, they're not going to think that blacks are oppressed, right? You'll get the oddball here and there. But on the whole, these factors are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. None of it's real. Keep in mind, you didn't think you were oppressed before any of this was told to you. And this is an experience that black and brown people have, is learning that they are oppressed. And the process of learning that they are oppressed, they have to be told it. They have to go to a class. They have to see a controlled media story, right? They have to see, like Rodney King or something. They have to see, it has to be told to them, right? They don't pick it up through their lived experience. That's the great irony of these claims about lived experience, is that it has positively zero to do with lived experience, right? Because those blacks and Hispanics who are the least connected to propaganda narrative, who aren't on Twitter, for example, they are the least likely to believe they are oppressed. The ones whose lives are most a function of lived experience are the least likely to think they're oppressed. So you have to be told this. This is something that is put into your brain from the top down. Right? This is a controlled narrative pushed onto you. It's not natural. It's not organic to you, right? It's something that someone else told you to believe, and that's why you believe it. And there's also the problem of how you experience white people in reality versus what the journalism bureaucracies tell you in the run-up to an election. Because of this, you have to say things like, oh, it's the cops, or it's corporations, or, oh, it's those neo-Nazis somewhere over the rainbow, right? It's like that one kid in your class who drew swastikas on the desk, right? He's the source of all your misfortunes, or something ridiculous like that, right? It's some hidden white person. It's not it's some ridiculously small minority of white people, right? Because the white people that you actually know aren't unfair to you, probably, for the most part. I mean, look, every person's a person, okay? But for the most part, this is true. So it has to be institutional racism. But all the institutions have pro-black discrimination. They have affirmative action, right? So what kind of institutional discrimination could there possibly be, right? Or it's implicit racism. But you look at any study that looks at, pro-black or anti-black or pro-white or anti-white bias on all sorts of things, in terms of, oh, how competent is this person? Oh, how much does this person deserve getting money, right? Except for a few minor things like how fat they believe you to be, it's all pro-black bias. And any simulation shows that cops are less likely to pull the trigger on a black person for given identical behavior than they are on a white person. And if you look at how many blacks are killed by police and compare that to the homicide rate and compare that to the percentage of cop killers are black, if anything, blacks are shot less than their proportion in those things. Blacks are underrepresented. Blacks, are shot less than they quote unquote should be. I don't think anyone should be shot, but, in the ratio, I mean. So because of all this, so it has to be something hidden, right? Because white people in your day-to-day life aren't actually biased, right? But, so maybe we're secretly oppressing you. Maybe we don't even know that we're doing it. I don't even know that I'm doing it. Somehow I'm oppressing black people by, well, maybe I'm oppressing black people by making these videos. But in general, in the big picture, we talk about white privilege, the invisible knapsack. Well, it's invisible because it doesn't exist.